Hello everybody, this is Mr Matthews. This is a GCSE English catch-up loom lecture. I've got 10 questions on an inspector calls, and I've got the answers obviously as well, so that you can quickly revise some of the key points about inspector calls. So, question number 1. When in history is the play set? The answer is 1912, so that's 2 years before the First World War. And of course there is a reference to the Titanic sinking. That was in April 1912. And in fact, the play is set, I think, a few weeks before the Titanic actually went down. So the answer is 1912. It was a time, apart from the Titanic going down, a time of class conflict. I've got a lot of strikes that are taking place in the coal mines, the docks, the railways. And the suffragettes were demanding rights for women. So it was a time when the Victorian class system was still very, very strong. And of course, it was a time when the workers were beginning to fight back against the system. Priestley, obviously, as a socialist, is on the side of the workers, but it is very different to the time when the play was actually written. So the play was set in 1912, 2 years before the First World War started. The Titanic sank, and it was a time of class struggle, industrial conflict, and the suffragettes campaigning to get the votes for women, and they were becoming more militant and more violent by about 1912. Question number 2. When was the play written and performed? The answer is in 1945 to 46, at the end of the Second World War. So this is the end of the Second World War, and it was at the time when the Labour Party, led by Clement Attlee, won a dramatic victory over Winston Churchill's Conservatives, which people did not expect, because they expected that Churchill, the great war leader, would continue as Prime Minister. Now, of course, because Labour was, supposed to be a socialist party, that would have pleased Priestley tremendously. So he would have been delighted. He would have been absolutely over the moon with Labour actually winning power. And of course, they went on to create the National Health Service and to make Britain a more equal society. So there's a huge difference, which I'll come to later on, between when the play was set and when the play was written and performed. So let's just go through that again. The play was set in 1912, and the play was actually written and performed in 1945. Question number 3. How does Priestley show that Mr Birling is a supporter of capitalism? Mr Birling comes across as an unattractive figure because Priestley is biased in favour of socialism and against capitalism. So these are some of the key points. He's a prosperous, which means he's rich. He's a prosperous factory owner, not the social equal of his wife. He's a self-made man. So he is somebody that Priestley recognises has not inherited all his wealth, but has actually worked and has achieved his great wealth. But that, in a sense, doesn't make him any more attractive in the way that Priestley presents him. His first priority is to make money. It's my duty to keep labour costs down. Now, the more you keep the costs of your wages down, the higher profits you make. And that, of course, is what capitalism is all about, making as much profit as possible. He welcomes Croft into his family as he represents a business link between his firm and that of Gerald Croft's father, a rival. Now, that means that if they merge the two firms, that means they can put their prices up. They become almost what we would call a monopoly, and they're the sole producer in the market, and they can make even bigger profits. So that, even more, is the supporter of capitalism. He has an honest approach to life. He tells the inspector that he wouldn't listen to Eva Smith's demand for a wage rise. I refused, of course, and is surprised why anyone should question why. So he believes the workers should know their place, and that it is not his business to give anybody a wage rise, any of his workers a wage rise, just because they demand it. This is very important. He strongly believes that a man has to make his own way. He does not consider the harm he may cause to other people because of his attitude. He's a hard-headed businessman. He is an individualist. He's an individualist. If you can put that down, I'll pause there for you to put that down. Capitalism is very much an idea of individualism. Individuals actually get on and become successful through their business enterprise and so forth. And he is very much an individualist. If you use that word in the exam, that will be good. That's a good word to use. Finally, he's a magistrate and a former mayor who was looking forward to receiving a knighthood. So he's obviously going up the social scale, maybe from the middle class almost up into the upper class. That's why, of course, he wants Shelia to marry Gerald Croft, because Gerald Croft are a bit more upper crust than he is. That's the other thing. Even the marriage of his daughter is kind of considered in terms of money. Now, this is actually, you could actually even here make a comparison with Christmas Carol and Scrooge. Remember that in Christmas Carol, Scrooge criticises his nephew Fred for marrying a girl who didn't have much money. So he saw marriage as being, well, you marry somebody rich so that you become richer, not love. And the thing is, how much is the marriage of Gerald Croft and Shelia to do with making more money? Because it'll be advantage to the family rather than love, which is what marriage is supposed to be. So you could do a nice little cross-link between the attitude of Scrooge to marriage and the attitude of Mr Birling to marriage. Question number 4. How does the inspector express the socialist ideas of Priestley? Well, obviously, throughout the play, there's this massive conflict between the inspector and Mr Birling. Everything that Mr Birling says, the inspector contradicts, and they really do not get on. Mr Birling really does wonder who this inspector is and where he's come from, and considers him to be quite rude and kind of obtrusive into his private life. But that's because the inspector is putting forward the ideas of Priestley, which are the ideas of socialism as against capitalism, the idea of people working together, more equal society, and so forth. And this is his final speech just before he leaves them. Just remember this, one Eva Smith has gone, but there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths, and John Smith still left with us, with their lives, their hopes and fears, their suffering and their chance of happiness, all intertwined with our lives, with what we think and say and do. We do not live alone. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. And I tell you that the time will soon come. If men will not learn that lesson, then they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. Good night. So, we don't live alone. We are responsible for each other. Eva Smith, if she had been looked after by Mr Birling, rather than just considered as a factor of production, just as a worker, then she would have lived. We are responsible for each other. If men will not learn that lesson, they will be taught it in fire and blood and anguish. That is the lesson, that we are all responsible. So it's this idea against individualism. If you like, you can put the idea of society, the idea of, if you look at the word socialist, it's very similar to the word society. So the idea of society pulling together, and that's what had happened in the Second World War, when people had come together to fight, to resist Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. There was that sense of social solidarity, people working together against a common enemy, which of course is Hitler. So it's this idea of pulling together and everybody looking after everybody else. That warning, by the way, about it'll be taught in fire and blood, I don't think that that's a reference to the First World War, because the First World War's got nothing to do with socialism and capitalism. It's a different thing. It's probably a reference to the Russian Revolution, which broke out in 1917 and which led ultimately to a communist society under Lenin and then later Stalin. But I think that is what Priestley is saying, because in Russia, which was much more unequal than it was in Britain, much more extreme than in Britain, the Russian ruler, the Tsar, did not take any of the warnings about how badly the people were being treated. And so therefore, in the middle of the First World War against Germany, that the people had enough and they rose up and they overthrew the Tsar. And eventually the communists came along in a second revolution and brought about a communist society. So I think that is what Priestley is referring to, rather than the First World War. This is question number 5. How does Priestley show the importance of social class in the play? Right, these are the themes. Mr Birling's biggest concern about Eva Smith's death is he won't get his knighthood because there will be a public scandal. He's obsessed with his position in society. So it's this idea that social class is more important than human understanding and human concern. He uses Gerald to promote his social class. He asks him to hint to his parents that he's expecting a knighthood. And he's also very pleased that his daughter is marrying into a higher class. So exactly as I said in the other slide, similar to Scrooge, you know, when he criticises his nephew, Fred, for marrying a poor girl, it seems as if the marriage of Gerald and Shelia is as much to do with pushing him up the class ladder. So he'd be a bit more upper class rather than middle class, because Gerald Croft comes from a sort of a bit more of a tough sort of background. And that is so important. So that Priestley's attacking the capitalist system because they're obsessed by social class, and that's what Britain was like in 1912. It was still very much a Victorian sort of society. It was the Edwardian period, named after Edward the Seventh, who came after Victoria when she died in 1901. But that Victorian idea of you should keep to your social class. And the social classes are really very strict and rigid. Okay? Priestley uses the play to reveal the unfairness of the class system. The play shows how Priestley saw society. Priestley presents the Birling's arrogant behaviour and selfish attitudes as common to the middle classes. So instead of being concerned about their workers, instead of establishing a community and doing the sort of things that a socialist would do, they are obsessed with becoming even richer and marrying maybe into the upper class. They're more concerned with that than they are with the kind of social conditions that Eva Smith faces, and that's why Eva Smith comes to such a disastrous end. Eva Smith could have been anyone. So Eva Smith is she is a sort of typical member of the working class, and she's obviously a woman as well. So she's doubly disadvantaged because men are more powerful than women. The other point that's been made here is by presenting Shelia and Eric as having changed at the end of the play, turning against the views of their own class, Priestley is saying that class isn't all that matters. Individuals can break out and choose to act differently. So what happens is they change. They actually recognise the socialist message that you should look after other people. They feel really sorry for Eva Smith and what's happened to her. Shelia is really sorry that she had Eva Smith sacked from the department store because she complained about her. And there's a humanity comes through, which you don't get with Mr and Mrs Birling, who at the end of the play, when they realise that the inspector is not a real inspector, all they're concerned about is, we're in the clear now. They haven't learned anything. But both Sheila and Eric have learned, they've become much more sympathetic. And in terms of the politics, they have become socialist in their views, which of course would be appalling to Mr and Mrs Birling. But that again is the kind of age thing which we will come on to. I changed the slide. So gender and age. Now gender is male, female. So women used as possessions by men. So the position of Eva Smith when she's being chatted up by Gerald Croft, and then of course the whole business with Eric. But even Mrs Birling, even though she's very rich and very privileged, she is not as powerful as her husband. And remember, at that time, this is the time of the suffragettes, no woman had the right to vote. Not even the richest woman in England had the right to vote then. And Sheila, is she really marrying Gerald Croft because she loves Gerald Croft, or because her father wants his family and the Crofts to unite because of the class and the business advantages? Women don't have the same rights as their men. So men are much more powerful than women. That's why the suffragettes, and you could mention that in the exam, you could say this was the time when the suffragettes were chaining themselves to Buckingham Palace, the railings, and 10 Downing Street, and were causing all kinds of problems, fighting with the police in Hyde Park and things like that, because they wanted the vote. Youth versus age is often highlighted. Eric versus Mr Birling. So Mr Birling is very much of the Victorian period. People should know their place. There should be order in society. But Eric is a kind of a new attitude, a more rebellious attitude, a more sympathetic to the working class attitude, because he sympathises with the position of Eva Smith, and the same thing with Sheila. Now that is something which always happens. If you think of the term left wing and right wing, left wing is more socialist, right wing is capitalist, left wing is Labour, right wing is conservative. Young people tend to be more left wing than older people. People tend to become more conservative as they get older. Even in the last election, in December of 2019, more young people voted for Labour and more older people voted for the Conservatives. So that kind of thing is always a factor. There's always this conflict between older people and younger people. And these issues highlight social changes to come in the future, when, of course, the play was actually written at the time, at the end of the Second World War. Question number 7. How had Britain changed between the time when the play was set and when it was written? So we've got 1912 and 1945. So in 1912, it was similar to the late Victorian period, very much class dominated. The working class must know their place. In 1945, Europe had just emerged from the Second World War, so it's completely different. The world has changed dramatically. In 1912, there's entrenched class and gender roles. But in 1945, Britain is energised by the defeat of the Nazis. Despite the hardships, there's a feeling of optimism. And by 1945, women had the same voting rights as men. In fact, that was before 1945. That was in 1928, when all women were given the same voting rights as men in Britain. In 1912, modern technology becoming more widespread, telephones, motor cars, etc. That was obviously reinforced very much by 1945. The First World War is a watershed between this era and the rest of the 20th century for 1912. So in 2 years' time, Britain will go to war against Germany. Landslide victory for Labour results in the creation of the modern welfare state, including the National Health Service. So it's a very, very different time. The National Health Service would not have been accepted in 1912 because it would have been seen as socialist, and that would certainly not have been accepted in 1912, but it was accepted in 1945. So you can do that and always remember the difference between when the play is set and when the play was actually written and was put on in the theatre. Question number 8. How does the character Shelia change over the course of the play? Right. Shelia is very important because she represents the change in attitude to be favourable to the socialist ideas that Priestley believes in. At the start of the play, she's vain. She resented Eva Smith being attractive and wearing a gown that she could not carry off, so she's interested in frivolous things. But at the end, she and Eric are the only cause for optimism because they change in attitude. They really feel sorry for Eva Smith and what they have done to bring her to this terrible end. She is accepting of the way things are and is indifferent to social hypocrisy. At the end of the play, she's affected by the inspector's revelations about family and society. So she has become a much better person, a much more humane person, a person who can connect to other people. At the start of the play, she's impressionable. She's willing to accept new ideas and concepts. So that comes through then. Her redeeming feature is that she's willing to accept her portion of responsibility and is truly sorry. So there are some good things about her at the start of the play. And at the start, she is comes across as an honest and attractive character. And at the end of the play, she helps the inspector to get to the truth in other characters' involvements. She's not cold-blooded like her parents are at the start, and she becomes a very attractive figure at the end because she realises that the inspector has taught them many lessons, even if he's not a real inspector. She doesn't think that that's important. Mr and Mrs Birling are absolutely delighted that he's not a real inspector, and it's just been, that it's just been a kind of a put-up job. But she realises that what the inspector said was very, very important. Question number 9. How does Priestley portray Mrs Birling as an unpleasant character? Well, she's a horrible snob. She looks down on people with less money. She's obsessed with money. She refuses Eva Smith's money for just having the cheek to use the same name as her, calling her a piece of gross impertinence. She's also a hypocrite and judges lower class people more harshly than her own family. She calls, in a moment of dramatic irony, her own son a drunken young idler. So she talks about a drunken young idler has got Eva Smith into trouble, has made her pregnant, and then realises that it's her own son. So she is a very unattractive character. She is obsessed with social class and not with any human features. In fact, her work on the charity might make her come across as a more attractive figure, but even there, she doesn't show any real charity. She's there to judge people rather than to help people. And the final question number 10. An Inspector Calls could be described as a didactic play. What does that mean? Well, this is a word that you can use to impress the examiners. Didactic means intended for instruction to teach. And teaching or intending to teach a moral lesson. What that means is the play is not just entertainment. Now, it is a well-written play, and it's got lots of it's got lots of interesting characters, and the dialogue is really good, and the way it ends, the dramatic and spooky way that it ends, is really good drama. So it is entertainment. If you went to the theatre and you saw some really good actors, or if you saw the version that was put on by the BBC, which was really good because the acting was really good, it's obviously entertainment, but it's something more than that. It's out to teach a moral lesson. And of course, in terms of Priestley, he's preaching socialism. He's preaching the socialist ideas through the play. So instead of writing about socialism in a politics book, he presents his socialist ideas through the play. And of course, the thing is, because you can identify with the characters and you can follow the story and the way the story develops, the socialist message is put over probably much more successfully, much more clearly than it would be if you just write a sort of a standard politics book. I believe in socialism because I believe in socialism because I believe in socialism because. Instead of doing that, he does it much more cleverly because he has the unpleasant characters like Mr and Mrs Birling be big supporters of capitalism and the class system. He has the inspector as the big supporter of socialism, and he has Shelia and Eric as changing their attitude and moving towards the socialist view. So, there we have it. So there are your 10 questions, everybody. So, I think, I don't know how long that's lasted, but there's plenty of things to get your teeth into there. Thank you very much for listening.